In Western Virginia's mountains, where century-old pines host a dancing fog and time appears frozen around 1920, exists a place America chose to forget. A small rural community in the Appalachians, odd, has become synonymous with a practice modern society deems an absolute taboo. For generations, marriages have occurred between direct relatives. The Whitaker family property is reached by a narrow, irregular dirt road, flanked by wooden houses defying gravity and rusty trailers. Kilometers before the destination, GPS ceases to function. It is as if technology itself rejects this place's existence. In 2020, a question haunting his mind led photographer and documentary filmmaker Mark Leiter into these mountains with a camera. How does an entire family endure decades of consanguineous marriage? The reality, he uncovered challenges any fiction. The Whitaker family is more than an isolated case of inbreeding. They are the extreme result of generations of absolute poverty, geographical isolation, and traditions perpetuated for over a century. Siblings Ray, Lorraine, Timmy, and Freddie Whitaker bear in their minds and bodies the marks of a genetic lineage turned inward upon itself. The eldest, Ray, has severe physical malformations. His head is disproportionately small for his body, a condition known as microcephaly. His intellectual capacity is severely compromised, communicating only through gestures and grunts. The only sister, Lorraine, has obvious facial deformities and motor difficulties that prevent normal walking. Though Timmy can speak some words, he has a severe intellectual disability. His face carries the unmistakable signs of consanguinity, facial asymmetry, an empty gaze revealing decades of isolation and serious dental problems. The youngest, Freddie, is the only one capable of basic conversation. Yet even he shows clear signs of cognitive impairment. The most shocking aspect is not merely the visible deformities, but the naturalness with which this family accepts their state. For them, this is the only reality they have ever known. The house contains no mirrors. No television shows them other families. They have no references from the outside world to understand how profoundly different they are. Their home is a heap of rooms devoid of running water, electric light, or any modern comfort. Every corner is impregnated with the smell of abandonment and mold. In the backyard, piles of trash accumulated over years form mountains of debris. It is impossible to determine where the garbage ends and what they consider personal belongings begins. Make sure you're subscribed to this channel, as this is one of the most extreme and documented stories of consanguinity ever recorded in the United States, and you will not find details like these anywhere else. To comprehend how the Whitaker family reached this point, one must go back to the 19th century when the first settlers made their homes in Western Virginia's isolated mountains. The Appalachians region has always been defined by extreme geographical isolation. Deep valleys, separated by kilometers of dense forest and insurmountable mountains, formed entire communities. This region's geography is merciless and brutal. Mountains rising abruptly to over 1,200 meters create narrow, isolated valleys where small communities have developed their own traditions, language, and culture over generations. During winter, snowfall can isolate these communities completely for consecutive months, forcing families to depend exclusively on themselves. Dr. Spencer Wells, a geneticist who specializes in isolated populations, explains that when small groups remain geographically isolated for generations, the genetic pool becomes progressively more limited. What happened in the Appalachians is a classic example of genetic drift in small founding populations, Wells states in his 2018 research published in the Journal of Medical Genetics. Wells further elaborates on the population bottleneck concept. When a population is dramatically reduced and remains isolated, it loses available genetic diversity, creating a vicious cycle that eventually leads to mandatory consanguinity. The documented history of the Appalachians is filled with similar examples. During the colonial era, whole families migrated to remote valleys seeking autonomy and isolation from the federal government. Many brought with them ancient European traditions, including marriage practices already considered problematic. The Whitaker family's roots in the region are documented since 1887, when John Whitaker settled in Odd with his wife, Sarah. Records from the American Census show that in the second generation, marriages between first-degree cousins began. The third generation saw marriages between siblings and half-sisters become common practice, not by choice, but from an absolute lack of alternatives. Disturbing details about how these unions were formalized religiously are revealed in the archives of the local Methodist Church, preserved in Charleston's historic library. Reverend Samuel Morrison, who served the community from 1920 to 1945, kept meticulous records of weddings, baptisms, and funerals. His personal diaries, discovered in 2019, contain passages describing his growing concern over the irregular unions he was forced to bless. In an entry dated June 23, 1934, Morrison writes, "Today I performed the wedding of Mary Whitaker to her own brother, Henry. The girl is only 16 years old and already carries visible signs of mental disabilities. Henry is not much better. Both are children of a union between father and daughter. Divine blessing." These entries continue for years, documenting progressively more problematic marriages. Morrison records at least 12 unions between first-degree relatives in the Whitaker family between 1930 and 1940. Each entry reveals his growing anguish, but also his powerlessness against a tradition perpetuated regardless of his approval. The isolation was not merely geographical. It was economic, religious, and cultural. The Whitaker family belongs to a fundamentalist religious sect that views the outside world as corrupt and sinful. Marrying outside the family was not just geographically impractical. It was considered a betrayal of religious and family values. This sect, known locally as the Church of the Elected, developed a peculiar theology that justified and even encouraged consanguineous marriages. Doctrinal manuscripts found on the Whitaker property include sermons interpreting biblical passages as divine commands to maintain the purity of God's lineage. The genetic consequences began to manifest in the fourth generation. Medical records from Charleston General Hospital, obtained via public information requests, show that between 1920 and 1950, at least 15 Whitaker children were born with severe disabilities. 8 died before the age of 5. Prolonged consanguinity results in what geneticists call inbreeding depression. Deleterious recessive genes, which typically remain inactive when a person marries a genetically distant partner, become dominant when both parents carry the same mutations. In the Whitaker case, genetic analyses performed by Dr. Michael Bamshad of the University of Washington revealed the modern siblings have a consanguinity coefficient of 0.355. This means they are genetically closer than would be possible even for normal siblings born of the same parents, indicating their own parents were the result of multiple consanguineous relationships. To put this number in perspective, Dr. Bamshad explains, a consanguinity coefficient of 0.355 is extraordinarily high. For comparison, the children of normal siblings would have a coefficient of 0.25. What we see in the Whitakers suggests at least 3 consecutive generations of unions between very close relatives. This level of inbreeding results in what geneticists term extreme homozygosity, a condition where virtually all deleterious recessive genes express themselves simultaneously. Dr. Sarah Martinez, a medical genetics expert at Johns Hopkins who studied the Whitaker case, describes the situation as a perfect example of the worst possible scenarios in human genetics. Martinez continues, what we see in the Whitakers is essentially the human equivalent of a highly endogamic laboratory lineage. They have accumulated so many deleterious mutations that it is a miracle they survive to adulthood. Their neurological development, immune system, bone structure, and cardiac function were all compromised by this extreme genetic burden. Detailed genetic tests revealed the Whitaker siblings carry at least 23 different recessive mutations in a homozygous state, all expressed at once. In a normal population, the probability of a person carrying even 5 of these expressed mutations is astronomically low. The Whitakers represent a statistically impossible convergence of adverse genetic factors. The physical malformations are merely the tip of the iceberg. Congenital heart problems, partial deafness, chronic kidney issues, and an extremely compromised immune system are part of these siblings' daily reality. Ray suffers from severe epilepsy with seizures that can last for hours. Lorraine has respiratory problems that make her constantly gasp as if out of air. The most disturbing aspect is that these siblings are the survivors. Local church documents indicate at least 7 other siblings were stillborn or died in childhood due to life-incompatible malformations. Paradoxically, the 4 who survived are the less severe cases of a genetic lineage that should have vanished decades ago. The perpetuation of consanguinity in the Whitaker family cannot be understood as merely an individual choice. It is the result of a complex system of poverty, isolation, and ignorance that has been self-fueling for over a century. Betty Whitaker, a distant cousin who managed to leave the community in the 1970s, provides a shocking account of the internal family dynamics. No one explained anything to anyone, she told documentary filmmaker Mark Leiter in an interview. Girls got pregnant by their own brothers, fathers, or uncles, and that was seen as normal. There was no sex education. There was no knowledge about genetics. There were no alternatives. Betty, now 73 and living in a Charleston elderly home, carries her own physical and emotional scars from life on the Whitaker property. She has lower finger deformities and slight facial asymmetry, signs that she, too, is a product of consanguinity, albeit to a far lesser degree than her cousins. I was considered the normal one of the family, Betty recalls bitterly. Because I could read a few words and do simple sums, it gave me enough courage to escape when I was 19. I walked 15 kilometers down the mountain until I reached the main road, where a truck driver gave me a ride to Charleston. Betty describes disturbing family rituals that show how consanguinity was institutionalized. There was a ceremony they called the Blessing of Purity, held when a girl turned 14. The family patriarch, in my time, old Thomas Whitaker, would choose which male relative would be that girl's guardian. It didn't matter if it was her father, brother, uncle, or cousin. The girl had no choice. These guardians held exclusive reproductive rights over the women assigned to them. Betty says resisting this designation resulted in severe punishment. Isolation in a dark basement, food deprivation, and, in extreme cases, beatings that left permanent marks. My younger sister, Rebecca, tried to escape 3 times. Betty remembers tears in her eyes. The 3rd time, they broke her legs with a hammer to ensure she could never walk far enough to escape. She died at 23, giving birth to her 5th son. All 5 babies were from our own father. Betty describes an environment where incest was not just tolerated, but encouraged by family patriarchs as a way to maintain lineage purity and ensure family properties weren't divided with outsiders. Old John always said that Whitaker blood was pure blood and that mixing with others was a sin, she recalls. Social assistance records from Raleigh County, obtained through public information requests, reveal that between 1960 and 2000, at least 23 Whitaker children were registered with the same father listed on the birth certificates of mothers who were their own daughters or sisters. The legal system simply ignored these irregularities, treating the family as a lost cause. If you too feel the weight of this story, comment now. How does a society allow this to happen for so many generations? For the current Whitakers, formal education never existed. Ray, Lorraine, Timmy, and Freddie never attended school. They cannot read, write, or perform basic arithmetic. Their only knowledge of the world comes from conversations with equally isolated and ignorant relatives. For them, their condition is normal because it is the only reality they know. Tragically, the cycle continues. Freddie, despite his cognitive limitations, has had at least 2 relationships with first-degree cousins. One resulted in the birth of a child who died at 3 months due to severe heart malformations. The second ended in a miscarriage in the 5th month of gestation. Dr. Robin Bennett, a genetic counselor at the University of Washington, explains that when the consanguinity coefficient reaches levels like the Whitakers, The likelihood of severe birth defects exceeds 50%. It is statistically more likely a child will be born with severe problems than born healthy. The family survives exclusively on government disability benefits, approximately $800 monthly, which barely covers basic needs. They depend on neighbors' charity for food and clothing. Once a month, a van from the local church brings basic groceries: canned beans, rice, old bread, and milk. The nearest health clinic is 45 kilometers away, and the Whitakers have no means of transport. They know no forms of social entertainment beyond sitting on the porch, watching the few cars pass on the dirt road. Their existence is silent and without perspective. My first reaction was pure shock, Leiter admits in an interview. But then came the realization that a family in such extreme conditions had remained completely invisible to the authorities for so long. The path is literally a land track created by decades of use by a single family. When I finally reached the home, I thought I was looking at a scene from a horror film. The photographer says he initially struggled to comprehend he was looking at human beings. Ray was sitting on the porch, and honestly, my first thought was of some haunted doll or sculpture. When he moved and made those sounds, I realized I was facing something I had never imagined could exist. Leiter tried to establish basic communication, but quickly realized the family's extreme limitations. Freddie was the only one who could form recognizable words, but even his responses were limited to yes, no, and a few loose phrases. I asked how old he was, and he answered a lot. I asked where he was born, and he pointed at the ground. The situation reveals deep systemic failures in American society. Raleigh County, where the Whitakers live, is one of Western Virginia's poorest and most neglected regions. With a population of just 78,000 spread over 600 square kilometers, social services are scarce and overloaded. Internal documents from the Department of Social Services, obtained through Freedom of Information litigation, reveal local authorities were aware of the Whitaker family situation for decades, but consciously chose to ignore it. It was not ignorance. It was a conscious political decision to treat the Whitakers as a problem that did not exist. The documents reveal at least 8 social worker reports between 1985 and 2005 describing subhuman conditions on the property. Each report recommended immediate intervention, and each was filed without action by supervisors who considered the case intractable. Morrison, a social worker in the region for 15 years, explains there are hundreds of isolated families in these mountains living in precarious conditions. Resources are limited, and cases like the Whitakers require a type of expert intervention that is simply not available in poor rural counties. The education system also failed the family completely. Records from the Western Virginia Education Department show that during the 1980s, truancy officers attempted to force the children to attend school. All attempts were frustrated by family resistance and the children's physical and mental state. Children with a strong odor, unable to communicate properly. The other children were frightened, and teachers lacked training to handle such severe disabilities. The negligence was not just educational. Reports from the local Charleston Gazette-Mail in 1995 and 2003 document at least 2 Department of Social Services investigations into improper living conditions on the Whitaker property. Both investigations resulted in reports that were filed without concrete action. The 1995 report described subhuman living conditions, an absence of basic sanitation, evidence of medical neglect, and possible sexual abuse. The Whitakers exposed the hypocrisy of a society proud of its family values, yet completely abandoning families that don't fit normative standards. The local community itself has an ambiguous relationship with the Whitakers. Some neighbors show genuine compassion, occasionally bringing food and clothes. Others see them as a local shame to be hidden from outsiders, viewing the family's condition as a divine curse or payment for ancestral sins. If this family is like this, it is because God has a purpose we cannot understand. This fatalistic resignation permeated any attempt at external intervention for decades. The Whitaker family was not just forgotten by the system. They were actively ignored by a community that preferred to treat them as an invisible problem. The Whitaker family's history transcends the sensationalism of extreme consanguinity. It touches on American rural poverty, institutional negligence, and the systematic abandonment of marginalized populations by failing health and education systems. Subsequent genetic studies have revealed the Whitakers are not an isolated case in the Appalachians. What makes the Whitaker case unique is not the consanguinity itself, but the extreme temporal duration and the complete absence of external intervention, explains Bam Shad. They represent a natural experiment on the limits of human survival in adverse genetic conditions. But this has also turned the Whitakers into a kind of human zoo attraction. Morbid tourists began appearing on the property, taking pictures and videos as if they were animals on display. This additional exploitation raised complex ethical questions about consent and human dignity. Media attention did bring some practical improvements. Viewer donations allowed for minor house reforms. The installation of a generator for basic electricity, a functional bathroom, and more regular medical care. Lorraine, now 65, is developing progressive respiratory problems. They are literally the last of their kind, a family that has reproduced to extinction. But the Whitaker history also serves as a warning. In America's poorest rural regions, thousands of families live in conditions of extreme social, educational, and medical vulnerability. Geographic isolation combined with poverty and institutional negligence creates environments where similar tragedies can develop silently. Dr. Williams, a social anthropologist at the University of Virginia who has studied isolated Appalachian communities for 20 years, notes that the Whitaker family is not an anomaly. It is the extreme result of social trends that affect thousands of families in the region. Multidimensional poverty, cultural isolation, and government abandonment create ecosystems where human tragedies like this are perpetuated for generations. Williams has documented at least 47 other families in the Appalachians with significant histories of consanguinity, though none have reached the Whitakers' extreme levels. What we see is a vulnerability gradient, she explains. The Whitaker family represents the most extreme point on a spectrum of social neglect that affects the entire region. The parallels are disturbing. Families like the Fugits, known for blue skin from consanguinity, or the Hartwells, whose members suffer from dwarfism and hereditary cognitive disabilities, show that the Whitakers are not an isolated case. They are simply the most extreme example of a regional pattern of isolation and endogamy. Research led by the Appalachian Health Initiative reveals that consanguinity rates in isolated mountain communities can be 15 to 20 times higher than national averages. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, who leads this initiative, states, "We're dealing with a public health crisis that has been ignored for decades." The Whitaker family represents the most severe endpoint of what happens when geographic isolation combines with economic desperation and social abandonment. The true lesson of the Whitaker family lies not in their deformed genetics, but in what their existence reveals about the profound failures of a society that refuses to care for its most vulnerable members. They are an uncomfortable mirror reflecting not just physical deformities, but the moral and social deformities of a system that abandons those who need protection the most. Dr. Bennett offers a dark final perspective. From a purely scientific viewpoint, the Whitaker family represents what happens when natural selection is artificially suspended. Under natural conditions, individuals with so many genetic deficiencies would not survive to reproductive age. It was not their genes that kept this family alive. This persistence, however, comes at an immeasurable human cost. Each day for the Whitaker siblings is a struggle against limitations no human should face. Their existence is simultaneously a testament to human resilience and a devastating indictment of a society that allows such suffering to be perpetuated. Today, as you watch this story comfortably from home with access to education, health, and opportunity, the Whitaker siblings remain in their home without electricity, without hope, and without a future. They're the ghosts of an America we prefer to pretend does not exist, yet who persist in the forgotten folds of a country proud of its opportunities for all. The Whitaker family will die in silence, just as they lived. But their story will endure as a permanent testimony to what happens when a society decides that some lives simply do not matter enough to be saved. They are the human price of institutionalized neglect, the genetic cost of social abandonment, and living proof that some tragedies are entirely avoidable if we only care enough to prevent them. Their lives pose a question directly to our collective conscience. If a society is judged by how it treats its most vulnerable members, what does the existence of the Whitaker family say about who we truly are? If you're not yet subscribed, subscribe now, because stories like this reveal truths that few have the courage to tell.